in society, all men, all white men at the time, were created equal, and most of our governments and most of our organizations are sort of premised on the idea that rational legal authority is what's going on, although that may not always actually be the case. But the assumption is there that everything has been developed in a way that is based on the needs of the organization and is a rational way to do business. So one of the things that I thought was interesting about the machine metaphor is the idea that it was very hierarchical, it was very structured, and it was very controlled. So the idea was that the managers were people who had some innate capacity to lead, to think complexly, to tweak and change the system when needed, and to decide who was capable of being a manager and who was capable of being a cog. And they were also given the ability to oversee other people's behavior and watch it very closely. It was very controlled. Now, this is premised specifically in Taylor's classical management theory on the assumption of a fundamental difference between the manager and worker's capacity for intelligence and production. So when we get to theories X and Y in the next chapter, that kind of surfaces some of the assumptions which are extremely classist about what the worker was capable of and what the manager was capable of. And those things can tie directly back to socioeconomic status, which is tied to education level. So within the mechanistic metaphor, some people are only good for putting bottle caps on bottles, and some people are born with some greater ability to think. And that can be traced directly back to, again, the kind of traditional authority that the mechanistic, sort of modernistic world was assuming wasn't in play anymore, but it really was. And so when you think about this assumption of this fundamental difference, what does that sound like? Well, it also sounds like the same justifications that were used for slavery, that slaves didn't have the capacity to operate at a human level, and the same arguments that were used to keep women from voting and working, etc. An assumption that women were physically, emotionally, mentally unsuited for that sort of work. And so you have to look very carefully and suspiciously at any system that is predicated on the idea that some humans are better suited for certain functions than others. Certainly we are all physically different and mentally different, but that's not based on necessarily our privilege. It's based on our individuality. So the other thing to think about is, in this kind of system, who benefited, who did not benefit, who was exploited, and who could prosper. So when you think about the American dream and the idea that if you work hard, you can get somewhere, this machine metaphor, not so much. In the way that it was conceived and applied during the early part of the Industrial Revolution, if you were a worker, you were always going to be a worker. There was no climbing the ladder. There was no middle management that you could aspire to. So you were taken from a family tradition, perhaps, of farming or an artisan of some kind, and then you became basically a cog in this machine with no future hope of anything other than surviving on a subsistence wage. So the only people who could prosper were the ones who had some level of control, which were the managers and owners. And so it really did actually reinforce the class system that was already in place, regardless of its claims of being highly rational and scientific. So to talk briefly about communication was officially in this system top-down. The owner communicates to the managers, who then command and control the workers. And so what I think is interesting about this is that controlled communication attempts to limit or ignores the presence of other kinds of organizational communication. So a good thing to start thinking about is what other kinds of communication happen in an organization other than direction from above? How do people interact? How does that affect organizational function? One of the interesting things about trying to control communication to me is that it shows an intolerance for ambiguity. So the idea that the workers might actually have minds of their own and be motivated to do something other than just be interchangeable parts in this sort of large machine made mostly of humans, definitely shows that the perception at the time was that everything had to be thought of in terms of a very reductive scientific method. And so Taylor, who is the father of scientific management, a little interesting background on him, he was super obsessive compulsive personality, and he spent most of his childhood trying to learn how to control and optimize things like eating, sleeping, and walking. So he was a little bit crazy. And when he grew up, he sort of projected that need for control out onto organizations and came up with this system, this very hierarchical controlled system for organizational functioning. Now, the kind of bizarre thing about that is still very much in place in a lot of organizations. So think about your organization. How does your organization reflect mechanistic thinking? Because it is the ground on which organizations are built. Whether or not they have progressed beyond that kind of thought into a more matrixed or flat organization or cooperative, the basic assumptions upon which organizations are built come from this self-styled scientific management. So if you look closely, you're going to see artifacts or remnants of that in your organization. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this type of organization? Certain types of production need a certain level of control to work. So perhaps auto factories need that amount of control. Perhaps McDonald's needs that amount of control. What does the machine metaphor obscure or ignore? So what is it that we don't see when we are viewing an organization as a machine that just needs to be tweaked and optimized in order to work perfectly? Maybe we're ignoring the human relationships. Maybe we're ignoring the power dynamics in politics. Maybe we're ignoring the potential of the employees and what happens when that potential isn't reached. So those are things we're going to cover as we move through the material. Chapter 3 is on the human resources perspective. So this is another metaphor. Some people call it the human resources frame. Other theorists call it the organismic perspective, which means thinking about an organization as an organism, like a cellular structure or a plant or something that has component parts that are all interlinked and interdependent as opposed to hierarchical. So what was interesting about the human resources framework is that it came from something called the Hawthorne studies, that started as this very reductive scientific study of how to optimize production by controlling light. So some poor schmucks had to sit in a room with somebody tweaking the light and then them observing how well they produced. But what ended up happening was that the results were inconclusive. And so another group of people came in and started to look at the social aspects of how people performed. And so what it did is it turned into a study of how these horizontal, meaning interactions not with the people above and below you, but the people at the same level as you, these horizontal informal interactions improve productivity. So they experimented with a group of women by sort of isolating them from the rest of the company and then allowing them to have breaks and snacks or coffee or something, and it made them happier. And so it really kind of blew the mechanistic approach out of the water by realizing that all of these other aspects of human interaction have a major effect on how people perform. So the perspective allowed the scientists slash observers to notice that there were informal networks, grapevine friendships, cliques that already existed and had some control over productivity, sometimes through common agreement and social pressure. So sometimes those groups would sort of come together and on some level agree that they were not going to produce too much or too little, so that nobody had to work too hard and nobody was being totally lazy. It's hard to know if that happens a lot in organizations, and sometimes it's just through nonverbal communication. It's through implicit stuff. It's through like shunning someone if they work too hard or putting them down if they're not working hard enough. But that tacit agreement amongst employees has no relationship to what management wants from them. So that was another aspect of the human resources framework that came to light. So next up, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're going to run across this over and over and over again. It is used all the time in leadership theory, management theory, and communications theory. It is one framework. So there are lots and lots of models. This is a framework for personal development and development through the adult life cycle. It's just one model. There are lots and lots of models. Models and theories are one way that people make sense of how their life is, how one theorist or a few theorists in particular make sense. So think of it as a colored lens that is small, that can see some things very, very clearly and can't see other things at all. So these frameworks are interesting things to look through, but you can also say, no, this really doesn't work, it doesn't make sense to me. You can criticize it, you can apply it, but never believe them implicitly. As we get into taking personality tests and trying to measure our own growth, you're going to hear me refer to those things as horoscopes. Not because I think that they are completely wrong and not based in reasonable research. It's just that no instrument, no matter how good, no quiz or test can tell you who you are. The reason why people like horoscopes and astrology is because looking at yourself through a different lens, thinking, oh, I'm a Pisces, so I have this dualistic personality, makes you consider things about yourself that you had not considered before. So whether or not you believe there's some spiritual significance to that, or there's some scientific significance to the Myers-Briggs or to Maslow's hierarchy, it doesn't really matter. The point is, it's a way of looking at yourself, your world, your perceptions that's going to slightly shift your perspective. And that's always a good thing, but should always be looked at with an open mind, but with a critical open mind. So that's my little preamble on Maslow. So just to go over the hierarchy of needs, there's a little triangle for you to look at. Physiological is really just what we need to actually live, the things we need to go on existing. Safety is really what we need to not live in fear. So if I am covered as far as food and water and shelter is concerned, but I have a coworker or a relationship that's abusive and scary, then my safety needs are not being met. Or I work in an organization that's having layoffs constantly. My safety needs are not being met because I can't relax enough to actually function. When we are in fear, our brains go into overload, our bodies exude cortisol, which makes it very hard for us to work at higher mental levels, and also makes us physically jittery because our bodies are working to help us run or fight. They're not helping us think. So safety needs are really important in organizations, and I think sometimes they're ignored because of the instability of our economy and of the business world right now. Anyway, so the next level, belongingness and love needs, that's also called affiliation. So it's the need for companionship. So it's the need to not be isolated, the need to have other people around you who are working towards the same thing, who you feel comfortable with, and maybe, appreciated by. The next level is esteem needs. So that's the need for external approval, external recognition, maybe the ability to be promoted, or to win awards, or to be able to get better jobs. It's that the world telling you that you're doing a good job kind of way of looking at it. And then the final level is self-actualization. This is also called individuation in psychology. And it's the need for personal fulfillment, personal growth. It's about internal fulfillment as opposed to external recognition. So we're going to run across this a lot. Comes up first in the human resources frame, but it's going to be referred to over and over again, and not just in my class. Okay, so we get to human relations, which was sort of the first phase of the human resources perspective. Theory X and Y on page 42, just to sort of break it down to its component parts, is the idea that as in Taylor's scientific management, people are sheep. They need to be directed. They need to be prodded. They need to be threatened and rewarded in order to perform anything because they're basically sheep. Theory Y, which is what this theorist was trying to promote, was the idea that people are naturally inclined towards work, development, achievement. Theories X and Y are also seen as management leadership theories, and they sort of are the seed of the modern, more pluralistic management theory that looks at multiple aspects of how organizations and people function. So theory X and Y is really there to point out that the current ways that people were looking at management only utilizes a limited amount of employee potential. Now, in reality, is theory X horrible and theory Y awesome? Or is there actually a little bit of both that can be useful depending on the environment that you're in? If you just give people, love and happiness and security, are they actually going to do anything? Do they need some kind of tension or ambiguity or a little bit of discomfort in order to achieve? I know that, I'm essentially a self-employed person, and I'm in grad school, and I have to have some deadlines in place in order to get some stuff done. So I have to have some discomfort and a little bit of fear in there to keep me moving, or else I might just sit in front of the television and paint my toenails and do nothing for a long, long time. And then I would be kind of miserable. So I am naturally inclined towards development and work and achievement, but I need a little bit of that structure. I need a little bit of that theory X. Maybe it's self-imposed structure, or it's a structure that I've kind of come to agreement, between my boss and my work, or my professors and me, that is the proper amount of structure for me. But I don't see it as an either-or proposition. Okay, so then the human resources framework comes into light, and you can see Blake and Mouton's managerial grid is on page 48 if you can't read it on the slide. And so it's this grid that sort of talks about two axes, concern for people and concern for results. So this is the more integrated version of X and Y, which is a little bit more extremist. And it's the idea that ultimately we have to help people develop, and we also have to help the organization survive. And so Blake and Mouton posit that the team management quadrant, which is the upper right quadrant, is sort of the optimal place to be, where work is accomplished from committed people through interdependence and a common stake in organizational purpose, and that builds relationships with trust and respect. Now, again, it also points out it's also starting to move us towards an idea that employees and managers work together towards common goals and play equally important roles. So the manager isn't the king and the worker isn't the subject. They're both people who are vital parts of a system, who are just playing different roles by nature of their skill set. So it's a little bit less draconian than what we've been looking at in the past. Now, what I want to point out is that, again, there's this idealistic way of doing things, and then there's the reality. So if you work at McDonald's, the authority compliance management is probably what's going on, right? It's all about efficiency and optimization and control. And there's going to be a little bit of human development because, the managers probably do come from the workers at some point if they're there for a long time. Now, I work in academia, and the country club management, which is 1-9, which is upper left-hand corner, I would say that the managerial style in academia in general is somewhere in between country club and team management, because the employees, the professors, are, highly degreed, accomplished people who work fairly independently. So we do not actually want someone working with us for our development all the time. We want some attention. We want the resources to be there when we need them, but we don't want to be constantly dragged into team projects, because we want to dedicate our energy to working with our students, not working with the administration. So that's just by way of example that different types of leadership, regardless of what the theorist says is optimal, are needed in different organizations. So communication in an HR organization is multi-directional. So it's top to bottom to top, sideways. Teams have their own types of of communication. Teams communicate with each other. There are social networks. Those social networks affect the traditional communication routes. So if I go and have lunch with a manager in another group, and we get to talking, and I say, oh, there's some problems going on, what can you do for me? Or I don't know what to do. And they say, oh, hey, I could help you with that. I have just informally created a new process or built a relationship that will change something going on in the organization that has nothing to do with my manager. So the HR frame acknowledges that communication is all over the place and is not just top down. So where the mechanistic metaphor basically ignored the presence of or the importance of any other type of communication, the HR frame acknowledges that all of these types of communication are valid and have an effect on the organization. And then the other thing is that in an HR organization, it's more informal. So I've had students who work in government, and sometimes their communication is more formal. There's, memos and stuff that gets sent out that's on letterhead. But for the most part, most organizations I've worked in and that my students work in, communication is all over the place. It's email, it's text, it's face-to-face, it's instant message. And it totally varies from organization to organization. I will say that in the academic realm, because I have less contact with my managers than I did when I was in the corporate world, communication is actually more formal because I don't want there to be any room for misinterpretation. So I err on the side of formality, even though I'm quite friendly with the people that I work for. Whereas when I was in the corporate world, we used an IM, like a chat feature on our computers all the time to communicate about work, about lunch, about our personal lives, about whatever. It was very loosey-goosey. So it very much depends on the organization you're in. So last part of chapter 3, look at the table on page 55 and think about which of these practices are actually prevalent in your organization and which ones are not. And then the final thing I want you to think about, which will come up more in the future when we talk about culture and power in organizations, are there any contradictions between how the organization says it behaves and what it actually does? So the one that stands out to me on the table is extensive training. I have never worked any place that has extensive training. So most of the places I have worked would definitely say that they adhere to this list of values. But seriously, has anybody ever had extensive training? Because I have never had it. From retail to academia to multinational corporations, I've worked in a lot of different organizations, and training is figure it out. I think I had 1 day of training at the multinational organization I worked at, and that was a lot. So the one concept I want to bring up, which will come up again later, is there is a theorist named Chris Argyris, and he has a theory called espoused theory and theory in use. So that is when your organization says, we love our people are our greatest asset, and then there's layoffs. So they're saying that their people are their greatest asset, but when things get really rough, instead of lowering, the C-level employees' salaries or taking away bonuses or having temporary cuts, they fire everybody. So there's a distinct difference between what the organization says it stands for and what it actually does. And that can create what is known in psychology as cognitive dissonance, which means discomfort and fear in employees who have to pretend that they believe that the organization is one way when they are actually recognizing that the organization is another way. So that's something to think about as we move forward. Okay. Final thoughts. So what aspects of organizational life do these theories leave out? I would say, off the top of my head, there hasn't been a lot of talk about politics yet. There's been talk of communication and networks and relationships, but nobody in these first few theories has recognized so much that there are power systems that exist outside of the traditional power systems. What has changed since these theories were formed? Certainly the internet has changed everything because communication and information are at our fingertips all the time, which totally changes the power dynamics and how organizations function. And then sort of adding on to that, how has technology either aided these theories or changed these theories? So, and there's an example in the book that, hidden cameras and internet monitoring has become very prevalent in many organizations, and that fits very much with the mechanistic metaphor of control, right? So if your employer is your customer service rep and they have a digital record of exactly how much time you spend on each call, and they can sit on you and say, you're not working fast enough, then that's technology being used to implement a very controlling type of management. On the other hand, technology can also be used to give people opportunities to take online courses and do training that fits more within the human resources, human development side of things. So give some thought to these questions because we may talk about them in class. Thank you for listening to the first lecture. I hope it wasn't too terribly long, and give it a listen and read the book and give some thought to your interpretation and where you agree with me and where you disagree with me, and be ready to talk about it in class. Have a good week.